Not necessarily. Particularly between vendors, we see that they're using different definitions. We're also seeing a lot of growth in a lot of closely related terms that aren't necessarily clear. Things like social computing, social media, social networking, social software. They're all fairly similar, but in some cases slightly different. Some of the vendors also will stretch the definition, particularly in the area of unified communications. So some will include things like voice over IP, web conferencing, instant message in collaboration. Some will put that as part of unified communications. That's why we have the term, at Gartner we tend to use the term UCC, unified communications and collaboration. It just kind of gloms them together because that is one of the trends we're seeing. They are beginning to kind of glom together. So on a high level, when people talk about collaboration, usually it's not as precise. They just kind of deal in saying it's how people work together. That's and whatever else gets attached to it kind of comes later. Some are, some aren't. In fact, one of the explicit goals of many of the social software initiatives is to reduce the dependence on email, because email is certainly a good thing. It has helped us become more productive, has helped surely shape the way that we work, but it's like many good things. When it stays around for too long, it starts to become the enemy. Or it's kind of like the house guest that comes for 3 days and ends up staying 6 weeks, and you're really happy to see them the first couple of days, but after they've been around for many weeks, then it's the appeal lessens. And so they're looking. So with many of the well-known problems that come from email around, there's email overload. You get hundreds of messages and you have to wrestle through them. People use it for wrong things. They use it as a document store. They use it as an instant messaging. They use it for a lot of things that's just not very good at. So it is the explicit goal of many of the social software initiatives to reduce the dependency that we have on email. We have to kind of distinguish in some way between the internal and external. Now we do see some signs of them beginning to come together, but for most enterprises they're treated differently. So when you're dealing with how you share information with your colleagues, with your boss, with the people in other locations, that is done in a very different way than the kinds of things you're doing with customers, dealing with prospects, with the larger kind of population. So where we're seeing a lot of the widest kind of activity often is with internal. At least that's what a lot of the IT departments are really involved in. And there we've seen lots of benefits around things like being able to share information, being able to keep track of colleagues, what kinds of things are they up to find a lot of those little kinds of comments, little kinds of bits of news that you wouldn't necessarily read a report for or send a specific email, but just to hear that somebody just signed a deal with a particular company, or they're going to go see a vendor about some issue, and that makes you think, well, I've got an issue there too, or maybe I can help them get more out of the meeting by giving some additional context. So I think those are, we've seen many examples of how companies are getting advantages in that way by using it internally. Using it externally, there's also are many. Just one example that we've seen just came with the recent ash cloud crisis in Europe, where some airlines, one that I looked particularly was KLM, they made use of things like Twitter and Facebook as an additional channel to communicate with their customers, which meant that they actually generated a fair amount of goodwill. Because if you look at the comments on the Facebook page and the kind of things that people were saying on Twitter, people were generally unhappy. When you get stranded for a week, you're not happy, and you're usually pretty angry with your airline. And certainly there were people who were unhappy with KLM too. That's inevitable. But there were quite a few who really appreciated the effort that they were showing, because there was a real voice behind it, a real person behind their efforts. They were helping individuals, and it became quite obvious. So that's another kind of an advantage. Where some of the disadvantages come from is often it comes from either ignorance or not really thinking through a lot of the initiatives, where these things kind of become botched, where they're not done particularly well. There are some small examples of just where people kind of do things without necessarily realizing what it means or what happens with it. One was an example that I heard of someone on Twitter who was working late, and he made a tweet that said, I have to work late tonight, closing the second quarter books, but boy, the numbers look good. Now, that sounds kind of innocent, because he was talking with his friends and he was just kind of sharing what he was up to, but he actually was releasing market-sensitive information before the regulators had been informed, which is a big deal. That's obviously a big problem. It wasn't malicious, but they needed to kind of understand what some of those implications are. There's also been many other cases personally of people who have said that they were sick, and then they post pictures of themselves at the beach, which is so that their boss can see it, which is a little silly. We've also seen examples where companies kind of get it wrong, where they will market in a very inappropriate way. I knew that of one. There was one retailer in Europe there was a social media conversation about the earthquake in Haiti. Huge disaster, lots of human suffering, lots of great compassion and interest in it, and they kind of tried to hijack that conversation to talk about their products, which was obviously incredibly bad taste. They had to apologize left and right, up and down. It made a fair amount of damage to them, just in terms of their offering. So if you get it wrong, there are certainly bad things that can happen too. A lot of what we see of many of the ones that are, particularly ones that are really pushed out, and when they're initiated purely by IT, it's usually done in a kind of a, here's something cool, go do something cool with it. And they just typically don't catch on. In fact, the reason why, if we look at failures, where there have been quite a few, the biggest pattern of failure is not that the technology breaks or that there's something spectacular. It doesn't explode or really do anything. It just slowly kind of dribbles away, and people don't see the point. That's why a very heavy business involvement usually is needed. Where we see the successes is where it is pulled by the end users, where it's pulled by the business people, because they understand why they want to do it, what they want to do with it, what they want to achieve. Because otherwise, when it's that kind of technology push, when the IT pushes it out, they're like, well, I've got work to do. Go away. They don't see the value. They don't see what it's delivering to them. It may be fun, but fun isn't enough. That's not enough to really kind of get their attention.